My beloved child. There is a moment in every life when something you have been waiting for so quietly that even you stopped admitting you were waiting for it begins to move toward you. You may not recognize that moment at first. Nothing dramatic announces it. There is no voice from the sky. No door suddenly swings open. No one appears in front of you with an explanation for all the years you spent wondering why certain things never worked out. Instead, something inside you becomes still. And perhaps that is what has been happening to you lately. You have been waking up with a strange feeling you cannot quite name. Not excitement exactly. Not sadness either. It is more like the sensation that a chapter of your life has quietly reached its last page, even though nothing around you seems to have changed. The same room is there. The same responsibilities are waiting. The same unanswered questions remain somewhere in the back of your mind. And yet, something feels different. You have begun to stop checking the door. You have begun to stop wondering who is coming. You have begun to understand that not every silence means abandonment. For a long time, you thought your waiting was about another person. Perhaps you imagined a face. Perhaps you never did. Maybe you only carried a vague feeling that somewhere there was someone whose heart would understand yours without requiring you to translate every wound you had learned to hide. You wanted that kind of love. But you were also afraid of it. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that being deeply cared for could be dangerous when the person caring for you did not know how to stay. So you became careful. You learned how to answer, "I'm fine," even when you were not. You learned how to smile without opening the door behind the smile. You learned how to miss people without contacting them. And eventually, you became so good at protecting yourself that you almost forgot what it felt like to be surprised by love. That is why what happens next matters. Because the person you have been waiting for does not arrive in your life as a reward for suffering. They do not appear because you finally became perfect. They come into the story after something inside you changes. And that change begins on an ordinary evening. You are not dressed for anything special. You are not expecting a message. You are not sitting beside a window waiting for some impossible sign. You are simply there, living the life you have learned to live. And for some reason, you pick up your phone. There is nothing unusual about that. You scroll without thinking. You look at old conversations you have not opened in a long time. And then you see something you had forgotten. A name. A photograph. A sentence. Perhaps it belongs to someone from your past. Perhaps it belongs to no one in particular. The detail itself does not matter as much as what it awakens inside you. For a moment, you remember who you were before disappointment became familiar. You remember how easily you once believed people. You remember how you used to think that if two people cared about each other, they would eventually find their way to one another. Then life taught you otherwise. You learned that two people can love each other and still hurt each other. They can miss each other and remain silent. They can stand inches away from reconciliation and choose pride instead. They can say, "later," so many times that eventually there is no later left. And perhaps that is why your heart became quieter. Not because it stopped believing in love. Because it stopped wanting to be fooled by it. You close the old conversation. You put the phone down. And you think the moment is over. But somewhere else, in a life you cannot see, another person is sitting with a memory of you. Not necessarily the version of you that exists today. The version they remember. The person whose presence once made ordinary things feel less ordinary. The person whose silence they misunderstood. The person whose kindness they accepted without realizing how rare it was. The person they thought would always be there. And they are remembering one particular moment. A moment so small that you probably never considered it important. That is how life often hides its most painful truths. Not inside grand events. Inside tiny moments we never knew were carrying the future. They remember the way you once asked if they had eaten. They remember how you noticed when their voice sounded different. They remember a time when they were trying to hide something and you did not force them to explain it. You simply stayed. At the time, they thought your patience was ordinary. Now they understand it was love. And that realization hurts. Because understanding something after losing access to it is one of the loneliest forms of regret. They sit there holding their phone. They open your name. They do not type anything. They close it. Then they open it again. There is a message they have considered sending more times than they would ever admit. It is not a perfect message. It does not contain beautiful words. It begins simply. I don't know if I should be saying this. They stop. Delete it. Start again. I've been thinking about you. Delete. I hope you're okay. Delete. They stare at the empty screen. And somewhere inside them is a question they have been avoiding for longer than they realize. What if the person they were searching for was never someone they needed to find? What if it was someone they needed to become capable of loving? That question frightens them. Because it removes every excuse. It is easier to say that the timing was wrong. It is easier to blame distance. It is easier to say that circumstances were complicated. It is easier to believe that you simply were not meant to be. But if the real problem was that they were not ready, then they have to face themselves. And that is where the story becomes deeper. Because your soulmate, if we imagine this as a story of hope, is not crying because some magical force suddenly delivered you to them. They are crying because something they once could not understand has finally become clear. They finally understand what your absence was trying to teach them. And perhaps, even more importantly, they finally understand what their own behavior taught you. You did not become distant for no reason. You became distant because you were tired of carrying a relationship that required you to keep proving that you deserved consistency. You did not stop caring overnight. You simply stopped abandoning yourself to keep someone else comfortable. There was a time when you would have accepted almost any explanation. You would have waited. You would have forgiven before the apology arrived. You would have made excuses for silence. You would have told yourself that people become distant when they are overwhelmed. You would have convinced yourself that love sometimes requires patience. And perhaps it does. But patience becomes painful when it is always demanded from the same person. So eventually, you made a quiet decision. You would no longer chase what could only be reached by hurting yourself. You did not announce it. You did not write a long farewell. You simply became quieter. And that quietness changed something. At first, the other person probably misunderstood it. They may have thought you were angry. Then they may have thought you were trying to make them jealous. Then perhaps they convinced themselves that you had moved on easily. People often create explanations when they are afraid to ask the truth. They imagined you had forgotten. They imagined someone else had entered your life. They imagined that your heart had closed. But the truth was more complicated. You had not forgotten. You had simply stopped waiting in the same place. That distinction matters. Because healing is not always the disappearance of love. Sometimes healing is learning that love does not require you to remain wounded. And that lesson changed you. You began doing small things differently. You stopped rereading old conversations when you felt lonely. You stopped checking whether someone had seen your message. You stopped interpreting every song as a sign. You stopped turning silence into a prophecy. You started sleeping without wondering whether your phone would light up. You started making plans that did not include a person who had not chosen to be present. At first, it felt almost cruel. You wondered whether becoming okay without them meant you had never loved them deeply enough. But slowly you understood something. Peace is not proof that love was false. Sometimes peace is what remains after love has finally been allowed to breathe without fear. And while you were learning that, they were learning something else. They were learning what it meant to lose the privilege of your presence. Not because you punished them. Because life simply stopped giving them unlimited access to someone they had once taken for granted. There is a difference. They could still remember you. They could still miss you. They could still wonder where you were. But they could no longer assume you would always answer. And one day, something happened that made the memories impossible to ignore. They encountered a situation where someone treated them the way they had once treated you. The details do not have to be dramatic. Perhaps they opened themselves emotionally and received silence. Perhaps they reached out and were met with uncertainty. Perhaps they offered patience and realized how exhausting it becomes when patience is never returned. Perhaps they found themselves staring at a message they had written, wondering whether sending it would make them look weak. And suddenly, they remembered you. Not romantically at first. Humanly. They remembered how many times you had stood in that exact emotional position. How often you had waited for clarity. How many times you had chosen understanding when you secretly wanted someone to understand you. The realization arrives quietly. You were not asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person to give it. That sentence stays with them. They put the phone down. They walk away. Then they come back. They sit again. And for the first time, they allow themselves to remember without defending themselves. The memories come differently now. They remember the day you laughed at something insignificant. They remember the way you looked when you were trying not to cry. They remember the conversations where you asked questions they avoided answering. They remember how you sometimes became unusually quiet after being disappointed. They had called it moodiness. Now they wonder if it was exhaustion. They remember the moments when you gave them another chance. And another. And another. Until there was no strength left for another. That is when regret becomes real. Not when someone says, "I lost you." But when they finally understand what their choices cost you. They cry. Not because they have magically earned another chance. Not because they suddenly possess you. Not because destiny has guaranteed a reunion. They cry because they can finally see the whole picture. They see the person you were. They see the person they were. And they understand that the distance between those two versions of yourselves was not created by one terrible moment. It was built from hundreds of tiny choices. A message unanswered. A conversation avoided. An apology delayed. A truth swallowed. A fear disguised as indifference. A moment when vulnerability was offered and met with hesitation. A door that could have been opened but was left closed. And still, somewhere beneath all of that, something remains. Not an obligation. Not a guarantee. A possibility. That is what makes the tears different. They are not tears of possession. They are tears of recognition. They finally recognize what was real. And perhaps you have been waiting for that recognition without realizing it. But here is something you need to hear, my beloved child. You cannot build your future around another person's realization. Their awakening belongs to them. Your healing belongs to you. That distinction protects your heart. Because it would be easy to turn this story into another form of waiting. To start checking your phone again. To wonder whether the message is coming tonight. To interpret every coincidence. To search for signs. To imagine a reunion before there has been a conversation. Do not return to the version of yourself that needed another person's action in order to feel worthy. That version of you has already suffered enough. If love returns, let it return through actions. Let it return through honesty. Let it return through consistency. Let it return through someone willing to sit in an uncomfortable conversation instead of escaping from it. Let it return through accountability. Let it return slowly enough that trust has time to grow again. Because the beautiful part of this story is not that someone is crying because they finally understand your value. The beautiful part is that you no longer need their tears to prove it. That is the change. That is the part you may not have noticed. Once, you wanted someone to choose you because you were afraid they might leave. Now, you want someone to choose you because they have learned what choosing someone actually means. There is a difference between being wanted and being valued. Being wanted can happen in a lonely moment. Being valued reveals itself over time. And the person sitting with your memory is beginning to understand that. They are not simply missing your presence. They are missing the person they were allowed to become around you. That realization can be overwhelming. Because sometimes we do not miss a person only for who they were. We miss who we were when they were near. And perhaps that is why their tears come. They remember laughing with you when life was difficult. They remember feeling understood without having to explain every detail. They remember the strange comfort of knowing someone cared about the small things. And they realize that they did not lose a perfect person. They lost a real one. A person with flaws. A person who became tired. A person who made mistakes. A person who sometimes reacted emotionally. A person who needed reassurance. A person who could have handled some things better. But a person who loved with sincerity. And that is harder to replace than perfection. Because perfection is an idea. Real tenderness is a memory. It lives in ordinary details. A cup left where someone liked it. A message sent after a difficult day. A joke remembered weeks later. A hand reaching for yours without thinking. A silence that did not feel uncomfortable. These are the things that return when the noise disappears. And now, their world has become quieter too. Perhaps they are driving somewhere and a familiar song begins. They almost change it. Then they don't. They listen. A memory rises. They remember you once sitting beside them, not saying much. They remember the way you looked out the window. They remember thinking that the moment was ordinary. Now they would give almost anything to understand why ordinary moments become precious only after they are gone. They pull over. They sit there for a while. And the tears come again. This time there is no anger. No pride. No attempt to explain it away. Just grief for what could have been. And beneath that grief is another emotion. Gratitude. Because even if the story never returns to what it once was, they finally understand that knowing you changed them. Perhaps you were never meant to be the final answer they imagined. Perhaps you were part of the answer. Perhaps your presence was meant to teach them something they could not learn any other way. Perhaps their presence taught you something too. You learned boundaries. They learned accountability. You learned not to confuse waiting with loving. They learned not to confuse silence with strength. You learned that forgiveness does not require self-abandonment. They learned that regret is meaningless if it never becomes responsibility. And somewhere between those lessons, two people who once misunderstood each other begin to see each other clearly. That is where love becomes mature. Not when two people finally stop hurting, but when they become honest enough to understand why they hurt each other. You may wonder whether they will come back. Maybe they will. Maybe they will not. A story of hope does not need to make promises that life has not made. What matters is that something has changed. You have changed. They have changed. And if your paths cross again, you will not meet as the same two people who separated. You will meet carrying everything you learned in the distance. And perhaps that is why the timing had to be different. Not because suffering was required. Not because you needed to prove your worth. But because some people meet before they have the emotional language necessary to keep what they love. They can feel deeply and still behave badly. They can care and still run. They can be afraid and call it independence. They can be wounded and call it self-protection. They can want intimacy and sabotage at the moment it becomes real. Growing older does not automatically cure these things. Awareness does. Honesty does. Taking responsibility does. And the person thinking about you tonight is beginning to understand that. They are looking at their own life differently. They are asking questions they avoided before. Why did I pull away when they needed me? Why did I become defensive when they were only asking for reassurance? Why did I assume they would always understand? Why did I think silence protected me? Why did I wait until they stopped reaching before I realized how much I depended on their reaching? Those questions hurt. But they are necessary. Because love cannot grow where every uncomfortable truth is buried. And perhaps that is what the tears are really about. Not simply losing you. Meeting themselves. There is a particular loneliness that comes from realizing you were the reason someone else felt alone. It is difficult to sit with. You cannot distract yourself from it forever. You can work. You can socialize. You can pretend to move on. But eventually, when the room becomes quiet, the truth waits. And they have reached that room. They sit there with no audience. No one to impress. No one to blame. And your memory arrives. Not demanding anything. Just present. They remember your face. They remember your patience. They remember your final quietness. And perhaps for the first time, they understand that your silence was not punishment. It was exhaustion. That realization breaks something open. They whisper your name. Then they laugh through the tears because they cannot believe how long it took them to understand something so simple. You had been telling them without saying it. I needed you to meet me halfway. They thought you wanted more. You only wanted equal. There is a difference. And perhaps you know that difference now too. Maybe you spent years believing that if you loved someone enough, eventually they would understand how to love you. But love is not a training program. You cannot teach someone to value you by suffering harder. You cannot convince someone to become emotionally available by becoming endlessly available yourself. And you cannot carry a relationship alone and call the weight proof of its importance. So you stopped. Not because your heart became cold. Because your heart finally became yours again. That is why something inside you feels different now. You are not waiting with desperation. You are living. You are becoming interested in your own life again. You notice small pleasures. You laugh without wondering whether someone else would have appreciated the moment. You make plans. You dream. You sleep. You wake. You continue. And somewhere along the way, you realize that your life did not end when the relationship did. It expanded. That realization is powerful. Because when love eventually finds you again, you will not approach it from emptiness. You will approach it from wholeness. You will not say, "Please stay because I cannot survive without you." You will be able to say, "I would love for you to stay, but I will not disappear to make that possible." That is a healthier kind of love. And if this person truly belongs in the next chapter of your life, they will have to meet you there. They will have to understand that the old version of the relationship cannot simply be reopened like an old door. Something new would have to be built. Slowly. Honestly. Without pretending the past did not happen. Perhaps that is what they are beginning to prepare for. Not a dramatic return. A truthful one. They may not know how to begin. They may write a message and delete it. They may ask a friend about you. They may look at an old photograph. They may wonder whether you would even answer. And that uncertainty is important. Because for once, they are experiencing what you experienced. They do not know whether the door is still open. And they finally understand that they are not entitled to walk through it. If they want another chance, they will have to knock. They will have to wait. They will have to accept that you may need time. They will have to hear things they do not want to hear. They will have to apologize without attaching conditions to the apology. They will have to accept that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. That is the work of real love. Not grand promises. Not dramatic declarations. Work. And perhaps you are ready for that kind of love now. Not because you have stopped believing in romance. Because you have stopped confusing intensity with safety. You know now that the strongest love may not be the one that makes your heart race constantly. Sometimes it is the one that lets your nervous system rest. The one where you do not have to decode every silence. The one where affection does not disappear whenever conflict appears. The one where disagreement does not become abandonment. The one where two people can say, "That hurt me," without turning the conversation into a war. Maybe that is the kind of soulmate story your heart has actually been waiting for. Not someone who completes you. Someone who can meet you. There is a quiet beauty in that. Because you have spent enough time searching for someone who could rescue you from loneliness. Now you are becoming someone who can sit peacefully with yourself. That is why love, when it comes, will feel different. It will not feel like rescue. It will feel like recognition. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, another person is beginning to recognize you. Not as a fantasy. Not as the perfect person from memory. But as the real person they once knew and failed to appreciate fully. They are beginning to understand that you had fears too. That you needed reassurance too. That your strength was not endless. That your patience had a limit. That your smile did not mean you were never hurting. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is this. You were never asking them to save you. You were asking them not to make you feel alone while you were standing beside them. They understand that now. And it hurts. But it also heals something. Because sometimes understanding comes late. Not late enough to erase the past. But early enough to change the future. That is the possibility you should leave room for. Not certainty. Possibility. If they return, let their actions speak before their words. If they apologize, listen without surrendering your boundaries. If they say they have changed, allow time to show whether that change survives inconvenience. If they say they miss you, remember that missing someone and being ready to love them properly are two different things. And if they never return, do not let that erase the transformation that already happened inside you. Because your life is not waiting for another person to begin. It has already begun. You are already inside the next chapter. Perhaps you simply have not realized it yet. And that is why the title of this story is not really about someone crying with happiness. It is about what happens when the person who once misunderstood your absence finally understands its meaning. You did not disappear to make them chase you. You disappeared because you needed to find yourself. And somewhere along the way, they began finding themselves too. That is the strange mercy of distance. Sometimes it separates two people. Sometimes it introduces them to the truth. And sometimes, after enough silence, both people finally become capable of hearing what love had been saying all along. Not, come back. Not, wait for me. Not, you belong to me. Something quieter. Something more honest. Become who you were meant to become, and if our paths meet again, let us meet without pretending we are still the people who hurt each other. Perhaps that is what your soulmate is beginning to understand. Perhaps that is why the tears come. Because for the first time, they are not crying because they cannot have you. They are crying because they finally understand what having you once meant. And because they know they cannot ask for another chance without becoming worthy of the responsibility that comes with it. Meanwhile, you are sitting somewhere in your own life, perhaps unaware of any of this. And that is okay. You do not need to know every movement happening beyond your sight. You do not need to chase the future to make sure it is still coming. Let tomorrow remain tomorrow. Let people reveal themselves through time. Let life unfold without forcing every unanswered question into an immediate answer. There was a season when you thought uncertainty was punishment. Now you may discover that uncertainty can also be protection. It gives people room to change. It gives you room to heal. It prevents you from building an entire future around a promise that has not yet been made. And perhaps that is the greatest gift hidden inside this strange chapter. You no longer need to know exactly who is coming. You only need to know who you are becoming. Because when love finds you again, you will recognize the difference. You will not be impressed merely because someone returns. You will notice how they return. You will notice whether they listen. Whether they remember. Whether they take responsibility. Whether their presence brings peace instead of confusion. Whether they can remain when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Whether they can love you on ordinary days, not only during moments of longing. Whether they can choose you without requiring you to beg. That is the kind of evidence your heart deserves. And if that person is the one you have been waiting for, you will not need to convince them anymore. You will not need to chase. You will not need to perform. You will not need to become smaller. They will meet you as you are. And perhaps one day, when you finally sit across from each other again, there will be no dramatic music. No perfect speech. No magical explanation. Maybe there will simply be silence. The kind of silence that once frightened you. But this time it will be different. They will look at you. You will look at them. And for a moment, both of you will remember everything. The beginning. The mistakes. The distance. The nights you thought it was over. The things that were never said. The things that were said too harshly. The versions of yourselves that did not know how to love without fear. And then perhaps they will say something simple. I understand now. You may not answer immediately. Because you will know that understanding is not the same as repair. So you will wait. And they will not rush you. That will tell you more than any speech could. Maybe they will reach for your hand. Maybe they will stop themselves. Maybe they will simply remain there. And in that restraint, you will notice something you once wanted desperately. Respect. Perhaps that will be the moment you finally realize how much you have changed. You are no longer the person who needs love to erase the past. You are the person who can acknowledge the past and still choose the future carefully. That is strength. Not becoming emotionless. Not pretending you never cared. Not convincing yourself that you no longer need anyone. Strength is being able to love without abandoning yourself. And if the person meant to walk beside you has truly grown, they will understand that too. They will not ask you to forget. They will ask what you need. They will not demand immediate trust. They will earn it. They will not promise that nothing will ever hurt again. They will promise to stop running from difficult conversations. And maybe that is enough to begin. Not a perfect ending. A truthful beginning. So, my beloved child, do not spend tonight searching for proof that someone is crying somewhere because of you. Do not turn your peace into another waiting room. Do not reopen every old wound simply because you wonder whether someone has finally recognized your value. Your value was never waiting for their recognition. It was there before they met you. It remained when they misunderstood you. It remained when they left. It remained when you cried alone. It remained when you finally stopped crying. And it remains now. If love is returning to your life, let it come honestly. If someone from your past finds courage to speak, listen with wisdom. If someone new appears, do not punish them for wounds they did not create. And if neither happens immediately, keep living. Keep becoming. Keep making room for joy that has nothing to do with romance. Because the greatest surprise may not be that someone finally chooses you. It may be that you finally choose yourself without feeling guilty for it. And from that place, love becomes different. You stop asking, will they stay? You begin asking, can we build something healthy together? You stop asking, do they miss me? You begin asking, do their actions make me feel safe? You stop asking, will they come back? You begin asking, if they do, have we both become people capable of doing this differently? Those are better questions. They come from a heart that has learned. And perhaps somewhere, another heart is learning too. Maybe the tears are real. Maybe the memory is real. Maybe the regret is real. Maybe there is a message waiting to be written. Maybe there is a conversation waiting to happen. Or maybe the story is preparing you for someone you have never met. You do not have to know tonight. Some things become clear only after you stop demanding clarity from the future. For now, let yourself breathe. The chapter that broke you does not have to be the chapter that defines you. The person who failed to recognize you does not get to decide whether you were worthy of recognition. The silence that once made you feel forgotten does not mean you were forgotten. And the love you once gave was not wasted simply because it did not receive the ending you hoped for. It became part of who you are. It taught you tenderness. It taught you boundaries. It taught you discernment. It taught you that a heart can break and still remain capable of love. And perhaps that is why, when the right kind of love finally stands before you, you will not need to run toward it desperately. You will walk toward it slowly. With open eyes. With a steady heart. With the wisdom that only life could have given you. And perhaps the person beside you will be crying then too. Not because they finally won you. Not because destiny handed them a prize. But because they will understand the extraordinary thing that almost happened between two ordinary people. Two people who once met before they were ready. Two people who made mistakes. Two people who lost each other. Two people who changed. And perhaps, if life is kind enough to bring them together again, two people who finally learned how to stay. Until then, my beloved child, let the future remain unwritten. You do not need to force the door. You do not need to knock until your hands hurt. You do not need to chase footsteps in the distance. If someone is meant to walk beside you, let them walk. Let them come with honesty. Let them come with courage. Let them come with a heart that has learned the difference between wanting you and caring for you. And when that moment arrives, you will know. Not because the sky will announce it. Not because every coincidence will suddenly make sense. You will know because there will be less confusion. Less fear. Less guessing. More truth. More peace. More consistency. And perhaps, after everything you have endured, that will be the biggest news of all. Not that someone cried because they finally got you back. But that you no longer need anyone to get you back. You found yourself first. And whoever comes next will have to meet you there. That is where your story changes. That is where love stops being something you chase and becomes something you can consciously choose. And perhaps somewhere, in a quiet room, someone is wiping their eyes right now, holding a memory they once thought they had outgrown, finally understanding why your absence felt different from every other absence. Maybe they are smiling through those tears. Maybe they are frightened. Maybe they are wondering whether there is still a door they can knock on. Let them wonder. Let them grow. Let them find the courage to become honest. You have your own becoming to finish. And if your paths are meant to cross again, you will not have to destroy your peace to make it happen. The meeting will find you. The conversation will find you. The truth will find you. And when it does, you will not meet it as the person who once begged to be chosen. You will meet it as the person who finally understood that being chosen by another human being is beautiful. But choosing yourself was the beginning of everything. So rest tonight. Not because you know what tomorrow will bring. Because you no longer need to. Somewhere between what was lost and what has not yet arrived, your life is still unfolding. Quietly. Tenderly. And perhaps, without you even realizing it, the very thing you thought was an ending was simply the moment both hearts finally began learning what love had been asking of them all along. Not to possess. Not to chase. Not to prove. But to become honest enough to stay.